Here we are. It is Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. Dr. King would have been 84 years old this year. And I can just see him sitting over there in a pew, deep in thought, hands clasped, waiting to hear if I'm going to offer some word this morning. You know what I'm saying? Now, this is my first time to preach MLK Sunday in my 7 years of ministry. And Dr. King and I have spent some time together this week. I have listened to 30 speeches. 30 speeches. And so his voice is echoing in my ear and in my heart as I speak to you this morning. So may I offer a word, Brother King? May it be so. 50 years ago this August, on my birthday actually, I'm not 50, I mean the day of my birthday, August 28th. I got some time before it's 50 years, but you know what I mean. 50 years ago this August, this great American who was taken from us way too soon, in whose symbolic shadow we now stand, led the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. It has been 50 years since the March on Washington and Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. This momentous speech came as a great beacon of light and hope to millions of people. And in the first 50 years since King's dream, we have seen the signing of the Civil Rights Act, the signing of the Voting Rights Act. And over the past 50 years, there has been a lot of firsts. African Americans have made it into the Supreme Court, into the PGA. Into the U.S. gymnastics team. Even the daughters of the American Revolution. African Americans have made it to daytime and primetime television, BET, and even their own network. But the first 50 years of Dr. King's dream also saw Gerald's trip to Africa. The first 50 years of Dr. King's dream saw Dorothy and her friend reaching out to one another, black and white, as children crossing the lines that earlier would not have been crossed. We have seen the beginnings of the desegregation of politics. And now, here we are, 50 years later, about to inaugurate our first African American president for his second term. His second term. But 50 years later, we must also face the tragic fact that the struggle for equality is not over. The cover of the history book of America may have been changed, but the pages in between are yet to be written. This week, even, a page was written that includes Ann Coulter claiming that black murder victims shouldn't count in comparing American gun violence globally. According to Ann Coulter, our national murder rate is not a gun problem, it's a demographic problem. It's a black problem. We have a long way to go. Formalized segregation has ended. Racism is no longer a lone ranger. It is now a gang of thieves. And so 50 years after the dream, racism now appears most prominently cloaked in the disparities of education and healthcare and the economy and sentencing laws and the war on drugs. 50 years ago, Dr. King spoke of the lives of African Americans being crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 50 years later, Dr. King, I am sad to report that segregation and discrimination still bind African Americans, but the oppressor has changed clothes. According to the National Urban League's State of Black America, the portrait of a black male, African American men are more than twice as likely to be unemployed as white males. Twice as likely. And black males who work in comparable jobs only earn 75% of what white men earn. Black males between 15 and 34 are nearly 8 times as likely to suffer from AIDS as their white counterparts. Black males aged 15 to 19 die from homicide at 46 times the rate of white males their age. Black men are nearly 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. Only 42.8% of African American boys graduate from high school. 42.8%. Compared to 70.8% for their white counterparts. Now, Dr. Becky Petit of the University of Washington has presented her research in a book called Invisible Men, Mass Incarceration and the Myth of Black Progress. Among her conclusions, by the time African Americans turn 18, 1 in 4 black children will have experienced the imprisonment of a parent. 1 in 4. More young black dropouts are in prison or jail than have paying jobs. Black men are more likely to go to prison than graduate with a 4-year college degree or complete military service. And black dropouts, get this, are more likely to spend at least a year in prison than to get married. Among low-skill black men, spending time in prison has become a normative life event, furthering their segregation from mainstream society. And so 50 years later, African Americans still, these are the words of Martin Luther King 50 years ago, they still languish in the corners of American society and find themselves in exile in their own land. 50 years later, the oppressor has changed clothes and discriminates not only by color, but also by class and by immigration status. You see, racism has gone into the closet, and it's time to come on out. 50 years ago, Dr. King marched on Washington to dramatize an appalling condition and to cash a check. A promissory note to which every American was fall to heir. That note was a promise that all would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the next 50 years must be not only about our common inheritance, our common cashing of that check, but our common investment. You see, the next 50 years has to be about our common destiny. To make manifest on the dream of Dr. King, we must walk with certainty that our destiny is tied together and our freedom is inextricably bound. So we've come this far, you see. We've come 50 years with a black problem needing a black solution, and we have seen some progress. But in order to realize this dream, the next 50 years, this can no longer be a black problem. This is an American problem. This is my problem. And it's your problem too. With our destinies interwoven, we will fight for the realization of the American dream. You see, as Dr. King said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so African Americans cannot realize this dream alone. There will be those who will ask, when will you be satisfied? You have an African American president. When will you be satisfied? We cannot be satisfied until the manacles and the shackles in this country are only serving justice.
All right. That's good. Yes. Say it again, T.
All right, babe. We cannot be satisfied until the manacles and the shackles in this country are only serving justice. We cannot be satisfied as long as the African American's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We cannot be satisfied as long as the African American's basic mobility is from one enslavement to another. No. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And so let us not wallow in a valley of despair. Because in spite of the difficulties and the frustrations of the moment, Dr. King's dream is still alive today. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. And one day, this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its professed national creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. Not some, not several, not few, but all are created equal. And one day, I believe, even in the state of Oklahoma, sweltering with the heat of injustice and oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. Oklahoma, where we incarcerate more women than any other place in the world. Oklahoma, a state where the great equalizer is not education, but hunger, the persistent rumble in our children's poor bellies. Oklahoma, where mandated ignorance ensures teenage pregnancy, will perpetuate another generation of poverty. One day, even the state of Oklahoma will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. One day, all of our children, filled with the seeds of potential for their purpose, will each be offered the soil of this nation in which to thrive. One day, I pray, our children will live in a nation where they will not be judged or limited or inhibited by anything other than the content of their own character. And it is up to us. It is up to us, Reverend Levenhar. It is up to you. We have been given the inheritance of 2 generations struggling to make Dr. King's dream a reality. And we must also invest in its future. So here we are, in a city where in 1921, a large-scale, racially motivated, violent attack first destroyed the wealthiest African-American community in the United States. What we do in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with our power and our love, carries with it seeds of redemption not only for Tulsa, but for Oklahoma and for the nation. And so I invite you to come walk with me. We will march tomorrow together. We will march against apathy and indifference and idleness. We will march against the illusion that the work is done. We will turn out in droves because power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. And so we will gather up our most durable power, love. Love implementing the demands of justice to turn our neighborhoods into brotherhoods and sisterhoods. We will march together, white and black and brown, atheist and agnostic, theist and Christian, Buddhist and Muslim. We will march because we continue to have legitimate discontent, as Dr. King said. Legitimate discontent about the inequality that continues in this nation. We will march together because I cannot be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be as well. We will march to recognize that this can no longer be an African American issue, an African American holiday, an African American problem. It is our problem. And so we will march together tomorrow in solidarity. And we will bring our children to plant seeds for the future, because this holiday is not a black holiday, it is an American holiday. Because Dr. King's dream is not a black dream, it is an American dream. And the dream is yet to be fulfilled. And the dream will not be realized until we can all claim it as our own. Elie Wiesel said that the opposite of love is indifference. And I say that the opposite of power is idleness. And so act against idleness and indifference by walking with us tomorrow. You have inherited a holiday. I invite you to invest in what it stands for by showing up. And beyond tomorrow, speak out against indifference by sharing your experience of claiming Dr. King's dream as your dream too. Speak out against the myth of our common culture that suggests that individuals or races are to blame for systemic issues, that parenting or lack of initiative is only to blame. We must be in the battle to repair our broken systems and at the same time help the child who needs us and stand up with the people who would like to see their world changed. Now, I had my own dream Friday night. All right. I had a dream. I always have these anxiety school dreams. It's just part of my life, right? You run around the hallways looking for the room where you can take your test, right? But this one, I had a take-home examination in a U.S. history class with a teacher who had made it very clear to me that she believed that the Civil War was not about slavery. Now, I was in disagreement, and so I called upon the highest authority I could think of. I'm dreaming, remember? The highest authority I could think of in this dream state, not the history professor at Harvard or Stanford or the University of Chicago. No, I dialed up another history buff and Lincoln adorer, President Barack Obama. And I remember feeling so grateful that he'd taken my call. He was gentle and compassionate and very patient, and he assured me not only was I correct in my interpretation of history, but he assured me that there was much power in the world looking to undermine the progress that had already been made. And the bizarre thing about this dream was that I kept having to put the president on hold. People and things in my dream were pulling me away from my very important phone conversation with the President of the United States. So I would apologetically put him on hold and go do something else and then come back to the phone. Mr. President, I'd say, half expecting him to have already hung up. I'm still here, he'd calmly say, not a grain of irritation in his voice. But I could feel this sense of urgency rising in me. I knew that I had to use this time with the president well, and yet I kept being pulled away, circumstance after circumstance. My daughter comes up to ask me to fix her something to eat. Dinner guests then arrive earlier than had been planned. Even my own gnawing hunger made me put the phone down and go get a sandwich. So the question for me from this dream, because I'm always analyzing, is, are we seizing the opportunity of this moment in time, in history, to do what we can to further the dream? We have to feed our babies and ourselves and our guests all around us, but we also cannot put the president on hold. Now is the time. I have to feed my child and leverage this moment in history and my power to make a difference. Will you do the same? See, in order to see this dream through, we have to develop a dangerous unselfishness. The question is not, if I stop to care for the hungry child or those in jail or the pregnant teen or the immigrant or the African American male, what will happen to me? The question is, if you don't do something, If we don't do something, what will happen to them? We are at a significant point in history, and the cover may have been changed, but the pages are yet to be written. So how can you leverage your power and your love today to make a difference? Begin tomorrow by walking with me. Amen.